I sat in an empty hotel room, staring at a police order that said I was a monster who could never see his children again. My wife had filed for an emergency restraining order. She claimed I was violently abusive. She submitted photos of her bruised arms and a heavily edited, blurry video clip showing me aggressively grabbing her wrist during an argument. The police forced me out of my own home in the middle of the night without letting me pack a bag or kiss my kids goodbye. She thought she had played the perfect game of legal chess. But while sitting in that hotel room, I opened my laptop and ran a background diagnostic script on my home router's traffic logs. I found a massive data stream uploading to an encrypted offshore cloud server. My wife didn't just frame me. She had secretly installed 5 high-definition hidden cameras in my house. And she forgot who configured the Wi-Fi. But to understand how a cheating spouse could so flawlessly weaponize the justice system against an innocent father, we have to go back to the cold coffee, the secret text messages, and a sociopathic exit strategy. I was a senior cybersecurity architect, the kind of job that paid well enough that nobody questioned the long hours. The encrypted laptop I never let out of my sight. The particular paranoia I brought home with me about locked doors and updated passwords. I spent my professional life hunting for the small, overlooked vulnerabilities that let bad actors into systems people trusted completely. I never once imagined I'd need those same skills to survive my own marriage. At home, none of that mattered. At home, I was just dad to Lily, 8 years old, who still insisted on holding my hand crossing parking lots even though she swore she was basically grown up, and to Noah, 6, who fell asleep most nights only if I read the same 3 pages of the same dinosaur book in the same exact voice. They were, without exaggeration, the entire architecture of my life. Everything else, the job, the salary, the house, existed to support the structure of being their father. Chloe and I had been married 9 years. For the first 6 or 7, I would have told you, without hesitation, that we were happy. She'd been warm once, present, the kind of mother who got down on the kitchen floor to build block towers without worrying about her clothes. Something shifted in the last 18 months, though, slowly enough that I kept explaining it away rather than naming it. She started spending hours at a gym across town, coming home flushed and distracted. Her phone, which used to sit face up on the counter, started living face down, locked, carried with her even into the bathroom. I tried everything I knew how to try. I suggested marriage counseling, and she agreed, though she spent most sessions staring at the therapist's bookshelf rather than at me. I planned a weekend away that she canceled at the last minute, citing a headache. I started picking up small gifts. Her favorite tea, flowers for no occasion, the small, almost embarrassing gestures of a man trying to remember how to reach someone who seemed to be standing progressively farther away. What I didn't understand, not until much later, was that I wasn't watching a marriage quietly dying of neglect. I was watching the early stages of something being deliberately, methodically built. The arguments started around 4 months before that night. Not arguments, really provocations. Chloe would plant herself in doorways when I tried to leave a room, screaming things I'd never once heard her say in 9 years of marriage, calling me cruel, controlling, dangerous, words that bore no resemblance to any version of myself I recognized. She'd shove at my chest, grab my shirt, once threw a coffee mug that shattered against the wall 18 inches from my head. I never took the bait. Every single time I did the same thing, gently moved her hands away from me, said something calm and useless like, "Let's talk about this when we're both calmer," and walked out of the room to let things cool down. I genuinely believed every single time that I was being the responsible one, the mature one, the one keeping our family from falling apart through sheer, patient restraint. I had no idea I was being filmed. I had no idea, sitting on the edge of our bed at 2 in the morning 11 days later, listening to a fist pound against our front door, that the woman screaming on the other side of it had spent 4 months building a case file against me, one staged confrontation at a time. The police were polite, in the strange, procedural way police are polite when they're executing an order they didn't write and don't fully understand the context for. 2 officers, a folder, a temporary emergency restraining order with my name on it, granted ex parte, without my presence, without my testimony, based entirely on Chloe's sworn statement and a video clip I hadn't even known existed. "Sir, you need to gather essential items only and vacate the premises," the older officer said, not unkindly, while behind him, in the hallway light, I could see Chloe standing with Lily and Noah pressed against her sides. Both of them crying, confused, asking why Daddy was leaving with police in the house. I begged, "I want to be honest about that, because there's no dignified version of this story." I stood in my own foyer at 2 a.m. and begged 2 strangers in uniform to let me hug my children goodbye, to explain to them that I loved them, that I wasn't dangerous, that whatever they'd been told wasn't true. The younger officer looked at the floor. The older one said, gently but immovably, that the order prohibited any contact, that I needed to step outside now, that this wasn't a conversation he had any authority to have with me. Chloe stood behind them, one hand resting on each child's shoulder, her face arranged into an expression of fragile, trembling fear that I recognized, distantly, as exactly the same look she'd practiced in the bathroom mirror before family photos. She didn't say a single word to me. She didn't need to. The performance had already done everything it needed to do. I drove to a hotel I'd stayed at twice before for work conferences, checked into a room with a view of a parking garage, and sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, in a life that no longer recognized me, until the sun came up. My lawyer, a measured, exhausted-sounding man named Aaron Brenner, who I'd hired off a recommendation from a colleague that morning, reviewed the petition over a video call later that afternoon, his expression growing more grim with every paragraph he scrolled through. "It's not good, David," he said finally. "She's got photos of bruising on her forearms, dated and time-stamped. And there's a video, 10, maybe 12 seconds, that shows you grabbing her wrist pretty aggressively during what looks like a heated argument. I know you're telling me there's context. I believe you. But judges in these emergency hearings see a video of a man twice a woman's size grabbing her wrist, and they don't take risks. They grant the order first and ask questions never, because the cost of being wrong the other way is a dead woman and a lawsuit. It doesn't matter that you were probably just moving her arm out of the way. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It matters what's on the tape. So what do? I asked, my voice flatter than I intended, exhaustion and disbelief blurring into something almost numb. Right now, nothing reckless. We request a full evidentiary hearing, we gather character witnesses, we build a counter-narrative. It's slow. It's going to feel unbearably slow. But you cannot contact her, you cannot go near that house, and you absolutely cannot do anything that lets her lawyer argue you're escalating. Her attorney is Richard Prout. You don't want to know how many fathers he's helped erase from their kids' lives. I sat alone in that hotel room long after the call ended, staring at a lock-screen photo of Lily and Noah at the beach the previous summer. Sand in Noah's hair. Lily's gap-toothed grin aimed directly at the camera, both of them utterly unaware that their entire world was about to be rearranged by people who claimed to love them. Somewhere around midnight, unable to sleep, unable to do anything except sit with a grief too large to hold still, I did the only thing that had ever made me feel steady when everything else fell apart. I opened my laptop. It started as nothing more than habit, a need to feel useful, to do something with my hands and my mind, instead of simply absorbing the unbearable stillness of that hotel room. I'd built a secure VPN backdoor into my own home network years earlier, a standard practice for someone in my field, allowing me to remotely monitor and troubleshoot our home systems without needing physical access. I logged in, intending only to lock down my personal devices, change a few passwords, make sure nothing of mine could be compromised while I was locked out of my own life. What I found instead stopped my breath entirely. The router's traffic logs showed 5 unfamiliar MAC addresses, devices I had never registered, never authorized, quietly active on my home network for what the logs indicated had been months. Each one was streaming a steady, significant volume of data, continuously, 24 hours a day, uploading somewhere I didn't recognize, an offshore cloud storage bucket, encrypted, routed through infrastructure designed specifically to be difficult to trace. I sat very still in that hotel room, the glow of the screen the only light, and felt something shift inside me. Not the collapse of grief I'd been drowning in for the past 18 hours, but something colder, sharper, and far more familiar. This was my territory. Whatever Chloe thought she had built, whatever trap she believed she'd sprung flawlessly shut around me, she had made one catastrophic mistake. She had built it inside a network I designed myself. I pulled up a packet sniffer, the same tool I used professionally to trace intrusions for clients paying me 6 figures a year to protect their infrastructure, and began isolating the traffic from each unfamiliar device, watching the data streams resolve slowly into something specific. Commercial hardware, motion-activated, high definition, 5 separate units, syncing continuously to a single cloud storage account secured by what turned out to be, once I started probing it, an almost laughably predictable password. The kind of password someone chooses when they've never once imagined the person they're hiding something from might actually go looking. It took me less than 10 minutes to break it. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before I clicked open the first video file, the cursor blinking against a black screen that was about to show me exactly how long, and exactly how completely, my own home had stopped being mine without my ever knowing it. The first file took 11 seconds to load, and it took less than 3 of those seconds for the floor to fall out from under everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. It was footage from the kitchen, time-stamped from 6 weeks earlier, the angle clearly mounted somewhere near the upper cabinets. A vantage point I never would have thought to check, because I had never once imagined I needed to. Chloe stood near the island, alone, scrolling her phone, and then, abruptly, she set the phone down, glanced toward the doorway as though checking for something, and began arranging items on the counter: a stack of mail, a coffee mug, a kitchen towel, with the deliberate, unhurried care of someone setting a stage rather than a kitchen. I sat in that hotel room and watched my wife rehearse. She practiced an expression in the reflection of the microwave door, something between fear and devastation, adjusting it twice before settling on a version that apparently satisfied her. Then she walked out of frame, and the recording simply continued, motion-activated, capturing an empty kitchen for the next 40 minutes until I arrived home from work. The actual unedited version of an argument I remembered clearly, remembered as Chloe screaming at me for forgetting to pick up dry cleaning, remembered myself saying almost nothing, remembered leaving the room within 90 seconds because I refused to escalate. The footage matched my memory almost exactly, except now I could see, from an angle I'd never had access to before, exactly how deliberately she'd positioned herself between me and the doorway each time, exactly how she'd angled her body toward the camera mounted near the cabinets rather than toward me, performing for an audience I hadn't known existed. I didn't sleep at all that first night. I sat at the small hotel desk with 3 monitors worth of work crammed onto a single 15-inch laptop screen, scrubbing through file after file with the same clinical patience I'd use auditing a corporate network for a client. Except every frame of this particular audit felt like a blade sliding slowly between my ribs. The mandatory mediation session was scheduled for the following week, a requirement before any further hearings could proceed, held in a sterile conference room downtown with beige walls and a box of tissues placed. I noticed bitterly, directly in front of Chloe's chair before either of us had even sat down. Chloe arrived wearing a soft gray sweater, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a way that read as effortless and was almost certainly the opposite. Richard Prout, her attorney, sat beside her in a suit that cost more than my first car, a leather portfolio open in front of him, radiating the particular confidence of a man who had won this exact kind of case so many times he'd stopped bothering to disguise his boredom. "My client is willing to discuss terms," Prout began, before the mediator had even finished her introductory remarks. "Provided Mr. Vance demonstrates genuine accountability for his conduct, we're prepared to recommend full primary physical custody for Mrs. Vance, the marital residence, both vehicles, and spousal support calculated at 80% of Mr. Vance's current income, continuing for a minimum of 7 years. I sat across the table, Aaron beside me scribbling notes, and said nothing, watching Chloe's face for any flicker of the woman I'd married. I found nothing. She studied her own folded hands with an expression of practiced sorrow, occasionally glancing up at me with something that might have read, "To anyone who hadn't spent the last 6 days reverse engineering her network traffic," as wounded vulnerability. "And if Mr. Vance declines these terms," Prout continued, leaning back slightly, "my client is fully prepared to pursue criminal assault charges, supported by the documented evidence already on file with the court. I'd encourage your client to consider, very seriously, what that outcome looks like for a man in his professional position." It was, I understood with a cold, distant clarity, an extortion dressed up in legal language, sign over everything, or face prison. I felt Aaron's hand briefly touch my forearm beneath the table, a silent instruction to stay calm, and I did, because I had already decided, somewhere around for that morning, that calm was no longer a coping mechanism. It was a weapon. "We'll need time to consider any settlement," Aaron said evenly. "We're not prepared to agree to anything today." Pruitt's smile didn't waver. "Take your time. The hearing date will arrive regardless." I drove back to the hotel that afternoon with my hands steady on the wheel, my mind already several steps ahead. Mentally drafting the Python script, I'd need to mirror the entire contents of that cloud storage bucket, without triggering a single access alert that might tip off whoever was monitoring it on Chloe's end. I spent the next 3 nights building it, a careful, methodical piece of code that authenticated using the credentials I'd already cracked, then silently cloned every file in the bucket to an encrypted local drive of my own, throttling the transfer speed deliberately so the activity would never spike high enough to look unusual against the system's existing upload patterns. I wrote it the way I wrote everything professionally: clean, documented, defensible. I knew, even then, that everything I extracted would eventually need to survive a courtroom, which meant every step had to be one I could explain, under oath, without flinching. By the 4th night, I had 11 weeks of raw footage sitting on a drive in front of me, organized by camera and timestamp, untouched and unedited. I went looking first for the night the restraining order was filed. I found it in the living room camera's archive, full resolution, timestamped accurately. And what I watched on that screen at 1 a.m. made something in my chest finally, completely uncoil. Chloe and I were arguing. About money, about the gym, about something so mundane I could barely follow it through the screen's tinny audio. And then, without warning, she crossed the room and snatched a heavy glass vase off the side table, raising it directly toward my head with both hands and a speed that left no ambiguity at all about her intent. I watched myself catch her wrist mid-swing, the same gentle, controlled grip I'd used a dozen times before, stopping the vase 3 inches from my skull. I watched her drop it deliberately a half-second later, letting it shatter against the hardwood, watched her clutch her own wrist and begin sobbing before I'd even fully released her arm. It was the same 10 seconds that appeared in the restraining order petition, cropped with surgical precision to begin exactly at the moment my hand closed around her wrist and end exactly before the vase came into frame. I sat back from the screen and breathed for the first time in what felt like days. I had it. I had unshakable, time-stamped, unedited proof that I'd done nothing but defend myself from a deliberate assault. A lesser version of myself, the version I'd been a week earlier, before any of this started, would have stopped right there, satisfied with simple vindication. I didn't stop. Innocence, I'd realized somewhere in the previous 72 hours, was not going to be enough. A woman willing to fabricate an assault charge to seize custody of 2 children was not going to be deterred by one piece of contradicting evidence and a polite settlement. She needed to be removed, permanently and completely, from any position where she could ever do this again. I scrubbed forward through the days following my exile, watching footage of my own house operating without me in it. And the next discovery arrived with a different, slower kind of nausea. 3 days after I'd been forced out, a man I didn't recognize walked through my front door without knocking, wearing gym shorts and carrying a duffel bag, moving through the kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who already knew exactly where everything was kept. I recognized him eventually from a photo on Chloe's gym's website, her personal trainer, a man named Brett, who appeared in subsequent footage over the following days wearing my bathrobe, eating breakfast at my kitchen table, sitting on the couch beside my children while they watched cartoons, his arm draped across the back of the cushions in a way that made my jaw ache from clenching. I kept watching. I told myself it was necessary documentation, evidence of the affair that would matter for the custody proceedings. And that was true. But it was also something rawer than strategy. A compulsive, helpless need to see the full shape of what had been built around me without my knowledge. It was on the 6th night, well past midnight, that the motion-triggered garage camera fired and produced a recording that I have never, in the years since, fully managed to stop seeing when I close my eyes. Chloe walked into the garage alone, glancing once toward the door behind her, as though checking it was locked, and crouched beside a workbench I recognized as my own, the one along the back wall where I kept tools I rarely used. She pulled open a drawer and removed a rubber mallet, the kind used for installing flooring, turning it over once in her hands with an almost clinical curiosity. Then she rolled up both sleeves, braced one forearm against the edge of the workbench, and began striking it. I watched her do this for nearly 4 full minutes, methodical, controlled, pausing periodically to examine the developing bruising with what looked, sickeningly, like satisfaction, before switching to the other arm and continuing. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch in any way that suggested genuine distress. She worked through it the way a person completes a tedious but necessary chore, checking her reflection in the dark window of the garage door once the marks had risen to a deep, convincing purple. I sat alone in that hotel room at 2 in the morning, the laptop's glow the only light in the space, and felt something in me go absolutely, permanently still. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. This wasn't even any more simple fraud. This was a woman who had calmly, deliberately injured herself with a rubber mallet to manufacture evidence that would take her own children's father away from them. And I understood, watching the recording loop back to its start, that whatever I built from this moment forward was not going to be about winning a custody case. It was going to be about making absolutely certain she never had the chance to do this to anyone, ever again. I didn't touch the raw footage again after that night, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood, with the same clinical precision I brought to every professional audit, that emotion was now the single greatest threat to everything I'd built. Evidence this devastating could be undone by a single procedural mistake. Richard Prout would tear apart anything that looked even slightly improper, and I refused to give him the opening. I spent the following week doing something far less satisfying than watching Chloe's deception unravel. I made it boring, defensible, and bulletproof. I hired an independent digital forensics firm, the kind corporate litigation departments use when a case absolutely cannot afford to lose on a technicality, and walked their lead examiner, a precise, unflappable woman named Dr. Patel, through exactly how I'd accessed the cloud storage, exactly what hardware had captured the footage, and exactly what chain of custody I needed established to make sure none of it could be dismissed as fabricated, tampered with, or illegally obtained. "You're a lucky man, in one specific sense," Dr. Patel told me during our first consultation, scrolling through metadata on her own secure terminal, "because you legally co-own the network infrastructure these devices were operating on, and because you can demonstrate you accessed only data flowing through equipment you yourself configured and administered. You have a strong argument that this falls under reasonable network administration rather than unauthorized surveillance. We'll still cryptographically hash everything, document every step of the recovery process, and produce an evidentiary report that will hold up to any challenge her attorney throws at it. But you did this the right way, David. Sloppy, and none of this matters in front of a judge." I felt, hearing that, something close to relief for the first time in weeks. Not because the horror of what I'd found had lessened, but because I now had absolute confidence that the horror would actually be allowed to matter, that it wouldn't get thrown out on some procedural argument before a judge ever saw a single frame. Dr. Patel's team spent 4 days generating a complete forensic report, SHA-256 cryptographic hashes for every file, an unbroken digital chain of custody from original capture to final extraction, sworn affidavits documenting every step of the process. It was, in its own grim way, a masterpiece of meticulous, boring documentation. Exactly the kind of unglamorous rigor that wins cases regardless of how dramatic the underlying footage might be. It was during this period, while I was deep in logistics calls with Dr. Patel's office, that the living room camera captured the recording that finally, completely extinguished any remaining doubt I might have carried about what I needed to do. Noah sat on the living room couch beside his mother, 6 years old, his small sneakers not quite reaching the floor, swinging slightly while Chloe knelt in front of him holding both his hands in hers. Her voice on the audio track was soft, patient, almost loving, the voice of a mother explaining something gently and carefully, which made what she was actually saying so much worse. "You know how Mommy explained that Daddy isn't well right now," she said, and Noah nodded, his small face solemn and trusting. When we go see the judge is going to ask you some questions. And I need you to be really brave and tell the judge the truth, okay? You remember how Daddy used to yell sometimes? How loud his voice got? Noah hesitated. Daddy doesn't really yell, he said quietly. He did, sweetheart, Chloe said, her tone never wavering from its gentle, coaxing patience. You probably just don't remember because you were scared. That's normal. But if you tell the judge that Daddy yelled all the time and that you were scared of him, that's what's going to help us. Because if you don't say that, Noah, the judge might let Daddy come back, and then Daddy might hurt Mommy again. You don't want that to happen, do you? Noah's lip trembled, his small hands tightening around his mother's. No, he whispered. Good boy, Chloe said, pulling him into a hug, smoothing his hair with a tenderness that made my stomach turn violently. Because I understood now that every gesture of warmth I'd ever watched her offer our children might have always carried this same capacity underneath it, the willingness to use them, completely and without hesitation, as instruments for whatever she needed. I had to step away from the laptop after that recording. I walked to the hotel room's small bathroom and stood over the sink for several minutes, gripping the porcelain edge, breathing through something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere violent and inseparable between the two. My son, my 6-year-old son, rehearsed like a witness in a trial he didn't understand, being taught to be afraid of a father who had never once raised his voice to him in his entire life. When I came back to the laptop, my hands were steady again. That mattered to me in a way I couldn't fully articulate, that even now, even after everything, I refused to let her turn me into the unstable, dangerous man she'd invented for the police report. I would be steady, I would be precise, and I would make absolutely certain that the consequences for what she'd just done landed with the full, immovable weight of the law, rather than anything resembling the chaotic, emotional outburst she'd spent months preparing a courtroom to expect from me. I sent that footage to Dr. Patel's team within the hour, along with the garage recording and 3 additional clips I'd flagged of similar coaching sessions with Lily, slightly more sophisticated given her age, but built from the exact same architecture of manipulation, witness tampering, perjury suborned through a minor. Combined with the self-inflicted injuries and the original assault footage, what I now held wasn't simply a strong custody case anymore. It was a complete, prosecutable criminal indictment, wrapped inside a family court hearing that Chloe and Richard Prout still believed they had already won. Over the following 2 weeks, leading up to the final evidentiary hearing, I kept my hand entirely hidden. I responded to Prout's increasingly aggressive settlement emails with calm, deliberately defeated language, allowing my own attorney to project exactly the image of a beaten, desperate father grasping for whatever scraps of custody he could secure. Aaron, who I'd finally briefed on the full extent of what I'd uncovered roughly a week earlier, played his role flawlessly, requesting minor procedural extensions, appearing cautiously pessimistic in every exchange with opposing counsel, never once tipping our hand. You understand, Aaron said to me quietly, the night before the hearing. Once this footage plays in that courtroom, there's no controlling what happens next. This isn't a settlement anymore. This is a criminal referral. She will very likely be arrested in the courtroom itself. I understand, I told him, and I meant it completely. There had been a version of this story, weeks earlier, where I might have settled for simple custody, simple vindication, simple distance from a woman who had stopped being someone I recognized. That version of the story had died somewhere in a quiet garage at 2 a.m, watching her calmly injure herself with a rubber mallet. And it had died again, completely and finally, watching her teach our 6-year-old son to be afraid of his own father. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and unremarkable, rain streaking the windows of the courthouse as I walked through the metal detectors carrying nothing but a single encrypted flash drive in my jacket pocket. Every piece of forensically authenticated evidence Dr. Patel's team had certified, compressed onto a device no larger than my thumb. I saw Chloe across the lobby before the hearing began, dressed in a modest navy dress, a tissue already clutched in one hand though no tears had fallen yet. Richard Prout beside her murmuring something that made her nod with the rehearsed solemnity of a woman, fully prepared to give the performance of her life. She glanced toward me once, briefly, her expression arranging itself into something fragile and wounded for the benefit of anyone watching. I held her gaze for exactly as long as it took to convey nothing at all. No anger, no fear, no hint of what was sitting in my jacket pocket. And then I walked past her into the courtroom, found my seat beside Aaron, and waited, calm and silent, for the only kind of justice that had ever truly mattered to me. The kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and fluorescent lit. The kind of room designed for efficiency rather than drama, which made everything that followed feel even more surreal once it began. Judge Eleanor Marsh presided with the brisk, unsentimental authority of someone who had clearly sat through hundreds of custody disputes and had long ago stopped being surprised by what people were capable of when children became leverage. She reviewed the case file briefly before nodding to Prut to begin. Chloe took the stand first, and I will admit, watching her settle into the witness chair, smoothing her navy dress with trembling hands, that even knowing everything I knew, even having watched the unedited footage with my own eyes a dozen times, the performance was genuinely, chillingly convincing. Her voice caught at exactly the right moments. Her eyes filled with tears that fell, one at a time, with what looked like reluctant, exhausted grief rather than rehearsed timing. "He grabbed me so hard I thought he was going to break my wrist," she said, her voice trembling beautifully. "I was terrified. I'm still terrified. I just want my children to be safe." Prut played the clip, the same 10 seconds I'd watched a dozen times by then, cropped with surgical precision, beginning at the exact frame my hand closed around her wrist, ending a half-second before the vase would have entered frame. The courtroom watched in grim, sympathetic silence. Judge Marsh's expression, when she glanced toward me afterward, carried an unmistakable weight of disgust. "Mr. Vance," she said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of someone who believed she already knew exactly how this would end. "Do you have any evidence to present before I rule?" Aaron rose beside me, buttoning his jacket with unhurried calm. "Yes, Your Honor. We have the rest of the plaintiff's video." A small ripple of confusion moved through the courtroom. Prut half rose from his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. Opposing counsel has not disclosed any additional. It was disclosed in our evidentiary filing 3 days ago, Your Honor," Aaron said evenly, sliding a certified copy across to the bailiff, along with a complete forensic authentication report from an independent digital forensics firm, including cryptographic hash verification, establishing an unbroken chain of custody. Judge Marsh studied the filing for a long moment, her expression shifting from polite skepticism into something sharper. "Proceed," she said. The unedited footage filled the courtroom's display screen. The same argument, the same kitchen, and then Chloe crossing the room, snatching the glass vase, raising it with both hands directly toward my skull, and my own hand closing around her wrist a fraction of a second before it would have connected, stopping it 3 inches short. The same gentle, controlled grip I'd used a dozen times to diffuse a dozen staged confrontations I hadn't understood, until that moment, had ever been staged at all. The courtroom went very quiet. Chloe's composure, which had held flawlessly through her own testimony, cracked visibly for the first time. That footage is doctored," she said, her voice rising, the careful tremor of grief replaced suddenly by something far more frantic. "He's a cybersecurity expert, Your Honor. He could fabricate anything. The forensic report addresses that directly," Aaron said, nodding to the bailiff, who handed Judge Marsh a thick certified document. "Independent third-party authentication. Cryptographic hashing performed at the point of recovery, sworn chain of custody documentation. We're prepared to call Dr. Patel to testify under oath if the court requires it." Judge Marsh's jaw tightened as she scanned the document. "Continue," she said, and her voice had lost every trace of its earlier sympathy. The garage footage played next. I watched the courtroom watch it, watched Prut's face drain of color in real time, watched 2 jurors, who weren't jurors in the gallery, press their hands to their mouths, watched Judge Marsh's expression shift from disgust into something closer to fury as Chloe, on screen, calmly, methodically struck her own forearm with a rubber mallet, checking the developing bruise with clinical satisfaction before switching arms. "Objection," Prut tried again, weaker now, his voice no longer carrying its earlier confidence. "Your Honor, we need time to review." "Sit down, counsel," Judge Marsh said without looking at him. The final clip played without anyone in the room asking for it. Noah, small and trusting, sitting on the couch while his mother knelt before him, her voice soft and coaxing, walking him through exactly what he needed to say to convince a judge his father was dangerous. "If you don't say it, Daddy might hurt Mommy again." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my life. Not the absence of sound, but something heavier. A held breath shared by 40 strangers who had just watched a 6-year-old being trained to testify against his own father. Chloe was screaming before the footage even finished playing. On her feet now, the witness stand's wooden rail rattling under her hands. "This is fabricated. This is a deep fake. He's been planning this. He's obsessed with technology. He could make anything look." "Mrs. Vance," Judge Marsh said, and her voice, when it finally came, carried a quiet, controlled rage that silenced the courtroom more completely than any gavel could have. "I have spent 11 years on this bench. I have rarely in that time witnessed evidence this comprehensive or a fraud this calculated." She turned the certified forensic report over once more before setting it down with deliberate, final precision. "The temporary restraining order is revoked, effective immediately. Full physical and legal custody of both minor children is granted to Mr. Vance, effective today." She looked directly at Chloe, who had begun sobbing in a way that finally, for the first time all morning, looked entirely genuine, not performance, but pure, collapsing panic. "I am also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for prosecution of perjury, filing a false police report, and child endangerment," Judge Marsh continued. "Bailiff, please take Mrs. Vance into custody." The bailiff crossed the courtroom and took Chloe's arm with the same kind of gentle, procedural firmness the police had used on me weeks earlier, except this time, it carried the full, righteous weight of the law behind it, rather than a fabricated lie. She twisted, screaming something incoherent toward Prout, who sat frozen in his chair, his career visibly disintegrating in real time in front of an audience that included, I would learn later, 2 reporters from local news outlets who'd been covering an unrelated case down the hall and wandered in out of curiosity. Judge Marsh wasn't finished. "Mr. Prout," she said, turning her attention to him with cold precision, "the court has serious concerns regarding your role in presenting deliberately doctored evidence and pursuing a case built substantially on subornation of perjury involving a minor. I will be referring this matter to the state bar for review." Prout said nothing. There was, I understood, watching the color drain entirely from his face, nothing left to say. I sat very still through all of it, Aaron's hand briefly squeezing my shoulder, watching the woman I'd married carried out of that courtroom in handcuffs, watching her lawyer stare blankly at a desk that no longer held any cases worth defending, and felt, for the first time in 6 unbearable weeks, the full, overwhelming weight of something close to relief settling into my chest. It wasn't joy. I want to be honest about that. There was no part of this that felt like winning, not really, not when it had cost my son 4 months of being taught to fear me, not when it meant explaining to 2 children, eventually, in language gentle enough for their age, why their mother wasn't coming home. But it was justice, complete and undeniable, and after 6 weeks of paralyzing helplessness, that was more than enough. I drove straight to the house from the courthouse, changed the locks myself with hands that had finally, completely stopped shaking, and stood in the living room when Lily and Noah came home from school that afternoon, picked up by a family friend who'd been quietly looped in over the previous week. Noah saw me first, standing in the doorway, and went very still for a moment, his small face uncertain in a way that broke something in me all over again. "Daddy," he said, like he wasn't sure it was allowed. "I'm here," I told him, kneeling down, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect. "I'm not going anywhere. You're safe. You're both safe." He crossed the room and threw his arms around my neck, so hard it nearly knocked me backward. And a moment later, Lily was there too, both of them holding on like they were afraid I might disappear if they let go. And I knelt on the floor of a house that finally, fully, belonged to the people who actually loved each other inside it, and held my children for a long, long time. I sat in an empty hotel room, once, staring at a police order that said I was a monster who could never see his children again. I walked out of the courthouse holding my children's hands, while the real monster was handcuffed and led away.